Our next speaker is a name we all know from sundew research, especially from he's been kind enough to give a lecture about sundews and other species of southern Africa. And I'm very glad he's here. Please welcome Andreas Fleischmann.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm mainly concentrating on Drosera and Roridula at the Cape of South Africa, and will present some of the species, not all of them, and their habitats, how they grow, and how they should be conserved, because many of them are quite endangered. So the Cape region of Africa, this is the southernmost tip of Africa, and this area here is the Western Cape region, and the area I'm talking about is especially this area, the Cape region. Here, the famous, Cape Town. And the Cape area, or Capensis, is one of 6 or 7 floral regions. These are regions with a unique flora, with special plant species which only grow there, which are called endemic species. They grow only there and nowhere else. And it's the smallest of all plant floral regions, but it has also one of the highest endemism rates. And there are at least 20 species of Drosera endemic to the Western Cape area, to the Capensis. The 2 species of Roridula, and Roridula is one of the very few plant families that is also endemic to this area, the Roridulaceae, and they occur nowhere else in the world. They have no close relatives, and that's what's called as paleo-endemic. Like Darlingtonia, for example, is also paleo-endemic. It's only growing in a very narrow range in the United States. And there's one species of Utricularia widespread, Utricularia bisquamata, quite variable. But Fernando and I, we were lucky enough to discover a new species of Utricularia also in this area, which I will show in a few photographs. So the typical vegetation is feinbush. This is a, where's the summary? Feinbush is the African word for fine bush, and it's a heathland, a shrub and heathland vegetation of so-called sclerophytic plants or ericoid plants, which have either reduced needle-like leaves or very hard, tough, coriaceous leaves to reduce evaporation. Because this is a rather dry area in the summer, it's a Mediterranean climate, so the Cape area gets a lot of precipitation in winter. They have cool and wet winters, but hot and very dry summers. And the soil is this sediment is sandstone, it's Table Mountain sandstone, and the soils are derived thereof, and they are peat-based, so typical heath land. And this kind of vegetation is typical for many carnivorous plants growing in Mediterranean climate. It's called campo rupestre, for example, in Brazil, or the savanna vegetation of the Guyana highlands, or in Australia you have this heathland. It's always quite similar, but the species composition is different. You see quite high vegetation. Characteristic families are Ericaceae, the heath family. Here, for example, one species, Erica sessiliflora. Erica, there are a lot of species in the Cape area. They have the center of diversity there, but not the center of origin. And especially the Proteaceae, like this leucadendron here, sometimes called silver trees in English. Or the famous king protea, which has this huge inflorescence. It's cup-like inflorescence. It's the national flower of the Cape. Or this Proteaceae. And the Restionaceae, the rushes or reeds. I don't have a very good photograph of them, but these are these grass-like things. They're not grasses, they're Restionaceae, a family which also occurs in Australia. And they form the dominant vegetation, which is called feinbush. And it can be quite tall, as here demonstrated by Robert Gibson and Kirk Hirsch. And among this tall vegetation, you can find some carnivorous plants, like this Drosera cistiflora, which is growing amongst these Restionaceae. Not so shaded because the vegetation is quite scattered. And in the tall fern bush, also you can find Roridula gorgonias, for example, growing also in this vegetation type. Then we have a more sparse vegetation, which is consisting of less herbaceous plants, less shrubs, but mainly Restinaceae, and that's called Renosterwald. I hope I pronounced these African names correctly. And in the more wet part of this Renosterwald, you can already find a lot of bulbs and corms. For example, this Gladiolus alatus, very nice plants, or orchids. And if you spot correctly, you can already see here a Drosera, that's Drosera trinervia. So in these seasonally wet areas, there are also Drosera growing, also in fairly dry areas here in this Renosterwald type vegetation. This is the typical habitat of Roridula dentata also. I will show photos of all these species later on, but you can see here these Droseras are growing in fairly dry, sandy soil. And it's even getting more sandy than the vegetation type is called sandfeld, where you can find a lot of reptiles, like this mole snake, but also vegetative or plant, carnivorous plants, of course. Like here, Drosera cistiflora and Drosera pauciflora, together with a lot of bulbs, and many annuals, like this Arctotheca and Dimorphotheca, cap daisies, which are commonly cultivated as ornamentals, as annual ornamentals, and a lot of bulbs, like here, this fantastic blue plant. This is Iridaceae. This is the genus Gysoritza. This is Gysoritza radians. And this plant has a striking color contrast because the tepals, the outer part is blue and the inner part is striking scarlet red. And there's this white line which marks this. And these striking color contrasts, they attract beetles. This is a very good idea, a very good way to recognize beetle-pollinated flowers, because beetles, they do not follow scents, they're not olfactory orientated, or not so much, but they usually follow strong color contrasts. You probably know this if you're outside here in Europe and you wear a yellow t-shirt going by bike, you will be covered with beetles, because they all see this yellow color contrasting with the blue sky, and they're attracted by these color contrasts, and the plants are using this. And among these bulbs, these Iridaceae, you can find these big white flowers, which are Drosera cistiflora, which grow in these seasonally wet meadows, in this sandfell vegetation. But I will start with those carnivorous plants of all habitat types which grow in permanently wet habitats, like these sea pages or dripping walls. And here you can see some people studying these plants. It's Fernando and Robert Gibson. And where you can often find sphagnum, which is an indicator that these areas are permanently wet, wet all year round. And maybe the most common, most widespread species in these wet habitats is these flat red rosetted Drosera. This is Drosera aliciae, which grows on Table Mountain, for example, in these wet dripping rocks, dripping walls, over poor Table Mountain sandstone, and where there are little cavities and little shallow ridges, there are some mosses and the Drosera aliciae, but even also on wood, on wet wood. You can find Drosera aliciae. In vegetative parts, this flat rosetted Drosera in South Africa, they cause the problems to a lot of problems to taxonomists previously, and especially the three species which are very similar. This is Drosera aliciae and the very similar Drosera admirabilis and Drosera cuneifolia. But in Drosera aliciae, the scape is always curved. That's why Salter described this species from a different location. He wasn't aware of the aliciae described by Hamé, and he described it from a different location as Drosera curviscarpa, which means with curved scape. And Drosera aliciae always has these curved scapes at the base, whereas the scapes in Drosera admirabilis and cuneifolia, they're always straight up, erect, straight up. It's a very good difference to tell them apart in flower. So here's Drosera aliciae. The previous photos were from the Table Mountain, and this is from the Silver Mine Nature Reserve at the base of Table Mountain. It's also a very hairy plant. The lower surface is covered with short white hairs. contrast to Drosera, the very similar Drosera admirabilis. Can be quite variable in shape and size. This is a plant growing in partial shade, which looks a little bit different. And here we have, for comparison, the tiny Drosera alisiae, that's a photo Fernando made, and the giant Drosera carnivolia. But carnivolia usually grows in more drier ground, and that's why I will show this species later on with the dry growing species. Maybe the most prominent Drosera, the Drosera species most people are familiar with is Drosera capensis. But the capensis we grow, this small leaf type, it's just one of many, many forms, because Drosera capensis almost looks different at every spot you can find it. And it's not a widespread weed, like we could assume from the plant in cultivation, where it easily propagates by seeds and by vegetative means, or from introduced sites in Australia or in the United States, where it's an invasive weed. But in the wild, it's really rare to find, and the populations are very scattered. So this is a very wet, here it's growing in wet quartzitic gravel or sandstone, always on wet ground. And at the Hifberg, it's growing on these wet dripping walls, and there's this particular red form of Drosera capensis in cultivation. It's called capensis red. It's originating from this northern location. You can see it's growing on these vertical walls in very wet soil. We found one single plant in flower because we were at the height of the cystiflower bloom, which means missing bloom of the other species, which flower later. Found many plants here, and this photo by Fernando illustrates how big these Drosera capensis sometimes can grow. Fairly large plant. And even wetter is Drosera admirabilis, which always grows in swiftly floating water, but partially submerged for most of the year. And Drosera admirabilis, the leaves are much more smooth. It does not have that many hairs. The rosettes are smaller, but the leaves are more cuneate, and the flower scapes are all upright. And Eric Green collected one plant, I think in the 1980s already, from Waynescliffe Valley, which he found floating in mats of algae. And this is this Drosera species floating in cultivation. But this is also Drosera admirabilis. And here you can see it forms a long stem or part of the root, and this upper part is floating on a mat of algae. You can push the plant down. You see the long marginal tentacles. And both Drosera capensis, Drosera admirabilis, and Drosera alisiae are widespread here in this Table Mountain area, but also in the western part of the Cape. Even Drosera capensis and alisiae far to the east. And there's one Drosera species which is restricted to a narrow area here, the Waynescliffe. Oops. This is this wet valley here along the White River drainage line. And in this wet places, the tallest and largest of all Drosera grows. You can see that this is wet habitat. Can easily be spotted out. But Drosera regia, it looks spectacular in cultivation, but it's rather difficult to find. This is Drosera regia just coming out of dormancy, and you may spot some leaves among tall grasses. And these are the people looking for Drosera regia. It's a national site. See all this big Restinaceae. This area hasn't been burned for long, so the plants are hidden among tall grasses, and you have to push all these grasses and Restinaceae to see Drosera regia with these long sword-like leaves, these thread-like leaves, which can be up to 50 centimeters. So not so spectacular, because this area at Waynescliffe is getting quite cold. There are two populations. This is the lowermost population, and the other one is maybe 200 meters higher elevated. And according to Eric Green, the upper location even receives snowfall in winter. And these are flowers from cultivation, because there are only very few clones of Drosera regia in cultivation. And many people told me that they can't produce seed because apparently Drosera regia was self-sterile, but it's not the case. Drosera regia has very unusual flowers for Drosera because they are somewhat zygomorphic. Normally they have radiary symmetry, and here everything is radiary arranged except the styles. And this is the same like you find it in Biblis. So the pollinator and the flowers are not horizontally but vertically. So the pollinator is approaching from here. It's humming or flying from in front. And the flowers are open for several days, and they are what is called proterandric. So this means the stigmas are still closed, and this plant is functionally male. The anthers are open and shed their pollen onto the pollinator, and to prevent self-pollination, these of the same flower, the anthers are closed. You see these little red tips. The styles are closed. This is a male flower. And after some days, excuse the bad quality, when the flower almost already wilts, then the stigmatic tips open, these fringed-like things. This is where the pollen has to be deposited to successfully pollinate the flower. And you can still take the pollen from here, from the own flower, and pollinate the flower to get some seed. This also works for Drosera cistiflora, which I will show later. So none of the South African Drosera is self-sterile. Self-sterility, this is a phenomenon only known in Australian Drosera. Several Australian Drosera you cannot pollinate with their own pollen. They have some chemical or some reproductive barriers not to self with their own pollen. Somehow they recognize that they are selfing. But it's not the case in any other Drosera. So this is the lower habitat of Drosera regia, and up there there's a little plateau where a more stunted and smaller form of Drosera regia grows, or I must say has been growing, because Fernando and I climbed there and we were searching for hours. But this area, this is a carpet of Restionaceae. This is Elegia capensis, a very tall species which can grow up to 1 meter. And this is not solid ground because the solid ground is deep below, and there's maybe up to 30 centimeters of densely packed dead leaves and shoots. And this, we walked across all this area. We found a lot of other things, scorpions and stuff, but not a single Drosera regia. So this site is probably extinct, or maybe there are some dormant roots and seeds still in the soil. But this area really needs some burning, and I will say this later when it comes to conservation and threat, that this is a national park, and what the authorities think, to keep the national vegetation, they have to prevent fire. But that's wrong. This fynbos vegetation is adapted to regular burning, and many species need this from time to time, because otherwise others become invasive, like here this Restionaceae. Well, now these were the species of wet habitats, which you should grow very wet in cultivation. There's 2 more species, Drosera rubrifolia and Drosera sluckii. We were not lucky to find Drosera rubrifolia, and Drosera sluckii we only found small species because the area was overgrown. Christian Dietz, Carsten Paul, and some other German friends recently visited the site, and it must have been burned because they found beautiful Drosera sluckii in open habitat. So in dry habitats, you see, this is an area where you wouldn't expect Drosera. It's just dry shrubland, but if you see here these yellowish spots, this is already one of the really nice Drosera species. This is Drosera hilaris, one of the very big Drosera species. It's a perennial species which forms an upright stem, but interestingly, it already is adapted to the dry season, where it survives as roots and the stem can die back, or more usually it forms an apical bud of condensed leaves like a hibernaculum in the European species, and regrows then from dormancy when in winter when it's getting wet again. And this species has really large flowers. It has no stipules anymore, and a strong tendency to form thick, big roots. And Fernando Rivadavia showed in phylogeny that the group of winter dormant Drosera, the cistiflora complex or section Ptychnostigma, they are not a natural entity, but they are part of section Drosera, so they're closely related to them. And Drosera hilaris might be seen as an intermediate from these upright growing stipule forming Drosera to the winter dormant Drosera. You see the large leaves are very hairy. That's where the plant got its name from. They're elliptic and they have no long marginal glands. And the scape is straight upright. Grows in thin bush vegetation where you can form tall stems. The tallest plant I found had a stem of 70 centimeters. And Drosera hilaris is known from the Table Mountain and its surroundings and reaching far up north in this area. This looks like this plant would be very widespread, but I just shaded the areas where it's occurring, but it's just punctual. There's one population here, another here, one here, one here. Actually, I should have added a lot of dots, but it was too much work. So I just shaded the whole area. And its closest relative, which was just recently described, is a plant which superficially looks similar like Drosera hilaris, but we first noticed that the scapes, these red scapes, they are very, very hairy and they are not upright, but they're curved at the base, which is a good taxonomic character in Drosera. And closer examination showed other things, like the plant possesses stipules. You maybe can see these brown things here, but you see the curved scape. But even more interesting, it has these long unifacial marginal tentacles, glands. For comparison, this is Drosera hilaris, which is lacking these, and Drosera hilaris has no stipules. And here in comparison, upright scape, no stipules, no long unifacial glands. And here in Eregreenii, we have these curved scape and here conspicuous stipules. So two quite distinct species. And in green, this is the range of Drosera hilaris, and red is the range of Drosera eregreenii. Actually, there's one single population of hilaris up there, but Drosera eregreenii is really potentially threatened because it's only known from just one location. Another species growing in these dry areas, very similar to Drosera hilaris, but the leaves are distinctly petiolate. This is Drosera ramentaceae. Also stem-forming, very hairy species. Here, detail of the leaf. And it's always growing very dry ground, like Drosera hilaris, and usually been close to some rocks, and the roots develop very long roots, up to 50 centimeters and longer. And these roots, they can grow everywhere in these little ridges and underneath the stones where some moisture accumulates, and they can deeply penetrate into the soil. And Drosera ramentaceae is only known from the Cape area, from the Table Mountain area. And another species which usually grows in this tall vegetation, stem-forming vegetation, in this tall vegetation and very, very dry, is this species, which caused some confusion. It was called Drosera species hermanus for some time. Robert Gibson, in his articles about in Carnivorous Plant Newsletter, he treated this as a form of, or a special local form of Drosera alisiae, but it's definitely not alisiae from flower morphology, and it's always growing very dry in contrast to Drosera alisiae, which is a species of very wet areas. This species has long marginal glands, and the lamina is only this part of the lamina is glandular. The stalk is not glandular. In contrast to Drosera alisiae, it's very hairy. There's quite different flowers. I can only show flowers from cultivated plants, but I cut them from this talk to keep it short. And it also forms columns of stems. Very old plants. Here you see the curved remnants of scape. And this plant, this particular plant, is even inhabited. If you see this hole here, there is some trapdoor spider which inhabits this plant. You can even see here the door. So this carnivorous plant gives home to another carnivore. And it's only known from this area around Hermanus here, just from the single location. And it's most likely closely related to this species, Drosera esterhuysene, which looks quite similar but has upright leaves and different flower morphology. Also these long marginal glands, very hairy, silver hairy leaves, and grows also upright and forms tall stems. And Drosera issehuizen is known from the same area at Gross St. Patrick with the previous species, but also known from one population more inland. And this tall vegetation, you can also find this species, Drosera glabripes. Many of you might probably know Drosera madagascariensis from cultivation. This is maybe the dry area counterpart. Drosera glabripes forms tall stems like madagascariensis. Could also be close to 1 meter. But in contrast to madagascariensis, it has very, very long stipules. And all these species growing in these dry areas are either very hairy or have very long stipules. And these are for collecting moisture from fog and mist. And you find this in all areas where Drosera grow in dry habitats in South America, or most prominent in Australia, as Ellen showed. Either they are very hairy like Drosera ardensis or lanata to collect the moisture from the leaves, or they form these huge stipules which are deeply fringed where some moisture can accumulate and run down the stem, like in the pygmy Droseras. So there's similar structures evolved on separate continents. And all specimens of Drosera glabripes highly branched from the roots and beautiful plants. And Drosera glabripes also shares almost the same range as Drosera hilaris. And where both species where Drosera glabripes overlaps the range of Drosera aliciae, this national hybrid is found sometimes Drosera corinthiaca, named by Robert Gibson and Eric Green, and it was named after these Greek temple columns because it forms also these columns, and it looks intermediate between both parent species. It's usually very rare. And the biggest rosetted Drosera, if you remember from Ellen's talk, Drosera erythrorhiza, Drosera cuneifolia is not a tuberous species. It's permanently growing, but it's growing in the same habitats underneath some shrubs, usually quite shaded and sandy soil, and it's also very flat and catches animals crawling on the ground, so it's occupying the same niche, same ecological niche. It can form tall rosettes of broadly cuneate leaves. The outer surface is very glabrous, and the scape, if there would be one present, would be straight and erect. And you can see, in comparison with my hand, that these species is fairly large. And Drosera cuneifolia maybe has the most restricted range of all South African Drosera, except Drosera regia. Drosera regia is only known from one single valley as well, but Drosera cuneifolia is only known from the top of Table Mountain and from the Silvermine Nature Reserve, which is the lower part of Table Mountain. So it's actually just one huge population, just known from this area. Whereas, in contrast, the most widespread Drosera in South Africa is this guy, Drosera trinervia. In every continent, you have one Drosera which is very, very common. In tropical Australia, it's Drosera burmannii, or in southwestern Australia, it's Drosera glanduligera, which grows everywhere. In South Africa, it's Drosera trinervia, a winter-growing, summer-dormant species with form a thick taproot, forms a red rosette, flat red rosette, which has every leaf has 3 nerves on the lower side. I don't know if it's visible, maybe in another photograph. That's why it's got its name, trinervia. And it's related to Drosera cistiflora and the other winter-growing species. Flowers are usually white in the south, and the more north you come, the plants are getting bigger and purple-flowered. And these large plants have been named Drosera afra by Paul Deppert. But I still consider them as Drosera trinervia because we found many, many intermediates. So they start from small white plants in the south, and in the far north you have large red pink flowered plants, but in between you have everything. So this would be Drosera afra, Paul Deppert's Drosera afra. And if you just compare this with trinervia, these many, many leaves and very long oblong leaves, you could consider this distinct, but there are so many intermediates. And the stipules, which Paul Deppert mentioned for his Drosera afra, they're not existing. Neither in these plants nor in the type specimen. Don't know what he was looking at. So they have rather big pink flowers, can be up to 1.5 centimeters in diameter. And when taking a photograph of this plant, I was lucky enough to catch the pollinator in action, which is this hawk moth, which is fairly quick, which is interesting because Drosera do not produce nectar. They are nectar mimics. They have glistening areas here at the base of the petals, which are especially prominent in some of the Australian Drosera. If you look at these metallic flower pygmy Drosera, then they look like the base of the petal would be wet, or there's some glistening around the ovary, but they do not produce nectar. And this guy here was apparently looking for nectar while pollinating the plant. And this is just for comparison. This is all from one location. This is what would be typical Drosera afra. This maybe even as well, and this Drosera trinervia, so you have all intermediates of flower size, color, and stigma shape. And another widespread species, but highly variable, is Drosera cystiflora. And you can just take what Ellen said for Drosera indica in Australia and use this for the Drosera cystiflora complex. Because I surely know that there are several species which even grow sympatrically. They co-occur, we find no hybrids. It's clearly that they are all different species. But there's a long list of synonymy, and many types are not present, so it's really difficult. I'm working on this group, but I think it will take several years to solve this problem. There are many, many different forms of Drosera cystiflora. It can be a small, stunted plant. All Drosera cystiflora grow almost like erect tuberous Drosera. They form a basal rosette of leaves flat on the ground, and then they form a tall stem. But of course, they produce no tubers, but long tap roots, usually 1 or up to 3 per plant. And then they produce the flowers, which are relatively big in comparison with the plant. This is a stunted highland form from the Baines clue, which produces only very few stem leaves and huge flowers. Flowers are always bicolored, so the petal base is usually dark colored. But you find also other plants with lots of leaves and very broad leaves, or some with narrow filiform leaves. This is all currently running under the name Drosera cystiflora. Flowers are huge. They are among the biggest in the genus. Only Drosera pauciflora has slightly bigger flowers, and they last for several days until pollinated. As I said, a dark petal base, which is quite shiny, which is probably nectar mimic. And it's all widespread all in this area, in the Western Cape, and sometimes even visible from a distance. You see these red spots. These are carpets of Drosera cystiflora. This particular form of small flower Drosera cystiflora, which can be multiple flowers, was described by Paul Deppert as Drosera liniflora. Can have several flowers open. They are very small. And as I said, it has 2 different colors here, but if you see, the interior part of the petal is green, and in this flower it is black. But this is a freshly open flower, and you see the anthers shed their pollen, but look at these stigmatic tips here. They are closed. And now this is a functionally female flower, where the center is getting darker and the stigmatic tips open, so it's pollen receptive. So these plants prevent self-pollination because they just are first male only, and then they are first functionally male, and then they're female or male and female if they still have some pollen. This was in one and the same plant. And as I said, these dark flower colors, they are an indicator for beetle pollination, and indeed at this population of Drosera liniflora we found many of these hairy beetles, which are called monkey beetles, scarabaeid beetles, which feed on the petals, which feed on the pollen, but as they do, beetles are not very good pollinators because they usually consume the flower they are pollinating. They are very primitive pollinators, but when they crawl around in the flower and go wild, on their hair, they're like a brush and get all these pollen sticking on them. Here it's feeding on the pollen, and you can see all these little pollen grains. And the flowers, they look quite ragged after the beetles have visited them. You can see. And what is interesting, that, whoops, here we have flowers of the white big flowered form of Drosera cistiflora with a dark center and white and yellow pollen. And at the same side, this plant is growing. That's maybe you know this bulb as an ornamental, this Ornithogalum, that's Ornithogalum terzoides, a liliaceae, and it's pollinated by this beetle, but the same beetle species. And this is not I didn't put the cistiflora there, they were growing like this. So Drosera cistiflora does not have nectar, this plant species has nectar. And I think this is the reason why Drosera cistiflora is so variable. It mimics other flowers. And this thrives plants into speciation, mimicking, floral mimicry. We know this probably from orchids, which is the most diverse group of plants. And these orchids, which make sexual mimicry, which mimic other insect females to be pollinated by the male of this insect, they totally went wild in the Mediterranean. They do not produce their own nectar. They are lazy. Nectar is cost-intensive. So they mimic other plants which have a nectar. Even for me, it was hard from a distance to distinguish these both plants, and I don't think the pollinators discriminate between them. So they feed on the pollen here and get some nectar, and then they looking for nectar here, feed on the pollen there. So this plant uses other plants. This is another form of cistiflora growing farther north, which has more narrow petals and is even bigger. And there's this species of Ixia, which is strikingly similar. Again, this plant is nectariferous, produces nectar. This one is lacking nectar. And here's another indicator. In South Africa, many plants are pollinated by beetles like this Isoaceae, this Mesembryanthemp, like a beetle clock almost, and they feed on the flower. And where you find these white cistifloras, you can also find this pink, smaller Drosera cistiflora. These are both currently treated as Drosera cistiflora, but of course this pink one is quite different. We didn't find a single hybrid. And here's Eric Green, who discovered this purple, dark purple or pink flowered cistiflora. And what is interesting in this cistiflora, it has very, very long stylar branches, and the petals are reflexed. I think the color is almost coming through. Yes, it's a very, very dark purple, a metallic purple, very, very dark. And at this area, there's this species of Ixia growing, another one, which is maybe to the pollinator eye similar. Here you see the reflexed petals and the upright stars. This species was easy to trace back from a herbarium specimen. This would be Drosera violacea. It has already a name. And we see a different beetle pollinator crawling around in the flower. And here you can see even some pollen sticking on its head. And here the remnants of pollen which it left. And it has very narrow leaves, this form of Drosera cistiflora, and it could caught a lot of these sand flies, which are like the puripuri Gerd mentioned from Venezuela, which are, well, Ellen mentioned from Northern Territories, which are very nasty. And that's why Fernando, for example, was looking like a beekeeper when taking the photographs. And here you can see these tall, white-flowered cistifloras and these pink, smaller ones with the reflexed petals, growing symmetrically, almost like a Drosera indica. If you go even further north, the leaves are getting more narrow, the plants are getting really red, and the flowers are also red. Paul Debert described this variety as Drosera rubri petala, but there's an old name already for this. Red flowers. I didn't catch the pollinator in action, but just here the leftovers, but Christian Dietz took some very nice photographs. These green beetles, I just always caught them flying away. I wasn't lucky enough to take a photograph of the pollinator. And in the same area, there's a species of Nemesia scrophulariaceae, which has a totally different flower design. But I also found these green beetles on these plants chewing on the petals. So it's probably mimicking this. It's because it's striking similarity in color patterns. So, and Fernando was able to collect different cistifloras, and this is Drosera pauciflora, at one single site, no intermediates. So we see here Drosera cistiflora sticking up, and these flat, big rosettes, they belong to Drosera pauciflora, also a winter dormant species, which forms long leaves, big leaves, and it's the Drosera species which can have the tallest flowers. Pauciflora means few flowered, and indeed it usually produces only 1 to up to 3 flowers, which can be up to 4.5 or 5 centimeters in diameter. Really tall. And it forms large clonal patches. Unfortunately, this location is extinct now. Because there was houses built on this. And there's this small plant which looks very similar to Trinervia, but it does not have these 3 nerves. And it has very, very short flower scapes only, single flower usually, and has scarlet, bright red flowers. And Paul Deppert, botanist from Germany, described this as Drosera coxypetala, which means the Drosera with scarlet colored petals. And indeed, it has striking red flowers. This is a photograph from cultivation, because we just found the single flower. It's fairly easy in cultivation. You can grow it like Drosera cistiflora. If you can grow cistiflora, you can grow this species. And this is only known from a tiny, tiny location as well in the area of Caledon. Sorry, up here. And this huge mountain massif, which is up here, this is the Gifberg, which is called, it means poisonous mountain. It's Afrikaans, because there's some plants which were used by local medicine people which are toxic. And on this area, not only the soil is red, it's red sandstone. This mountain is flat plateau like a tepui, and it's very wet. Eric Green says every time he comes here with people, it's raining. And when we were there, it was also raining, that our shoes were filled with water from above within a few minutes. It was really wet up there. The soil is very sandy, it's sandy and loam, but very shallow, these outcrops of sandstone. It's almost like on a tepui, and there are shallow depressions where water accumulates, and along these shorelines you find these red Drosera species. This is Drosera alba, maybe the most beautiful of these winter-dormant species, which forms large patches on very shallow soil. It's just a few centimeters of soil where this plant is growing in. Really red leaves. It's growing together with a large flowered form of Drosera Utricularia bisquamata, which grows as an annual. But Drosera is not annual. It forms a rosette of, like Drosera cistiflora, a rosette of rosetted leaves. And then it forms a few upright red, blood red leaves, thin filiform leaves, like in Drosera filiformis or graminifolia. Plants in shade are rather green. You see some prey. You see this is just shallow soil over bare rock. Here's some lichens. And that's the reason why this species does not form a taproot which is going straight down, but which is going flat on the ground horizontally. And it does this even in cultivation. It does not go right down there, but flat on the ground. And maybe this is also used for asexual reproduction, maybe to form these large colonies. Why is it called Drosera alba? Because the plant is blood red, because the flowers are white, or usually whitish or pink tinged. And there's a photo by Fernando Rivadavia from a different location. You can see an open flower where it was not so rainy. And this is also impressive because this plant apparently is first male, or first female, sorry, but here the anthers already open, maybe that's the second day. But at the end, you see this flower was increasing in size, so this opened for several days. The stigmatic tips are closed, and they're sealed by some red substance. So probably this plant is proterogynic, so first female and then male, and does it the other way around. But I have to prove this from plants in cultivation. So, and it's growing together with Drosera cistiflora quite often. And Utricularia bisquamata. This is a fairly large form of bisquamata, an annual. Bisquamata in its natural habitats usually is always annual, and is not like the small weedy one, small flowered one. And we found this species. I heard Fernando yielding, I found a new species. And this is really unusual Utricularia. It's tiny. And I first thought, well, maybe that's a tiny Utricularia, you see, a tiny Utricularia bisquamata. But close examination shows it's not, because it has no palate. The upper lip is totally different, and it has a very, very short spur. It's annual and always one-flowered. So we really discovered a new species of Utricularia, which was so far not observed. Here you see this species together with a small form of Bisquamata. This whole plant is tiny. This is maybe 2 centimeters tall. Flowers are minute, and we discovered this in 2006. And I was so happy. I thought, we discovered the smallest species of Reticularia. But I was disappointed because 1 year later, Ellen published this Reticularia simondsii, which would be like this, which is dwarf. You can't beat the simondsii down. So, and now for the 2 species of Roridula. Roridula gorgonias is growing in wet fynbos vegetation, together with Drosera slackii, for example, admirabilis, and Aliciae in very wet habitats among tall proteroid fynbos, so with a lot of proteaceae like Leucodendron here. You can see sticking out here Roridula gorgonias plants. This is at Hermanus. Here's the coast somewhere, so very coastal plant. And the soil here is always wet. It's a seepage area. These plants always try to grow above the surrounding vegetation. And there was some discussion about Roridula, because Roridula is not related to Drosera. Early botanists believed this, but it's related. It belongs to the Ericales, so to the heath family order. And its closest relatives, believe it or not, are the Sarraceniaceae, the New World pitcher plants, and the Actinidiaceae, the Chinese gooseberry family. So it's very, very isolated. These are the closest extant relatives, of course. Everything in between got extinct. The closest relatives of birds are crocodiles, but just because dinosaurs got extinct, so I think Sarraceniaceae ancestor didn't decide to get sticky leaves. There were many, many other plants in between which got extinct, so that's why we have this strange relationship today. But the sticky glue of the Roridula, it's not aqueous, it's not water-based mucilage, but this glue is resinous. And this causes a problem to this plant. In Ericaceae, usually there are many sticky plants, and even some rhododendron species, they have a sticky calyx, but it's always a resin. And enzymes do not resolve in resin. So they cannot produce enzymes from their glands. But they solved it by a very clever way, because they evolved a symbiotic relationship with hemipterans, with capsid bugs, mirids, of the genus Parmeridea. And these bugs, they almost exclusively live on Roridula and feed on the many insects which Roridula catches. And they deposit their feces right on the leaves here. And Roridula is adapted to this. First of all, the upper surface of the leaf is not glandular, only the margins and the lower surface. So there's a runway, there's a path for these bugs to crawl, to walk. And these bugs also can get rid of this sticky glue. When they got it on their legs, they can whip it away. And this upper surface of the leaves, they're covered by hairs, and the cuticule, which is normally sealing the leaves, in Roridula has tiny, tiny little openings, so-called cuticular gaps. And the tissue below these cuticular gaps, it's highly absorptive. There were some experiments where they put some dye, some ink, and it's absorbed into the plant immediately. And these highly absorptive tissues are usually found in carnivorous plants, in the gland heads of Drosera or in the glands of Nepenthes for nutrient uptake. And then scientists made some experiments, and they fed nitrogen-enriched Drosophila flies to Roridula, where these bugs on, and they measured the nitrogen content within the Roridula plant. And fantastic is that Roridula can take up to 70 or 80% of the nitrogen content of prey, like this little thing here, via the bugs. And, well, odd carnivorous plants, which do the normal way, producing their own enzymes, usually get 30 to 50%. So this is by no means an underdeveloped pre-carnivorous plant. This is more carnivorous than every sundew or Nepenthes, which is interesting. And Bruce Anderson and Alison Mitchley, who did most of these studies, coined in the term symbiotic digestive mutualism, so for this pathway of carnivory. And it's really a special adaptation. So, and both the plant benefits, of course, because it does not produce own enzymes, but can use the feces and digestion products of the bugs, and the bugs have home and shelter. They lay their eggs directly into the bark of the Roridula, and Bruce Anderson observed that they cannot reproduce without Roridula. They cannot lay their eggs in other plants, apparently. So they need the Roridula as well. Another point that this symbiosis must be a very old one, and Roridula must be very ancient inhabitant of South Africa. Here we have another of these bugs, and here you see some feces, some deposits of the bug. And for a long time it was also thought that the bugs are pollinating the flowers. That's what the first observers thought these bugs are for. But these are big, conspicuous flowers, and they are surely pollinated by other insects, by flying insects, maybe bees or bumblebees. But observations in the wild are rare. But you can find the larvae quite often. And both species of Roridula, this is a flower of Roridula gogonias. In Roridula gogonias, the anthers open by little slits and release the pollen, whereas in the other species, it's quite different. They shed the pollen from little holes which have to be buzzed in Roridula dentata, like in Biblis or Helianthera, which is also an indication for me that they cannot be, the pollinator cannot be the bugs, they cannot buzz pollinate. It has to be large bees or bee. You can see the slits of Roridula gogonias. And Roridula gogonias is known from 2 existing populations, and these 3 are probably extinct. They're very, very sparse. Very few plants have been found there recently, if any. And at this location near Hermanus, we count about 15 to 20 plants in 2006. So it's really few plants. It's one of the really endangered carnivorous plants of the Western Cape. And whereas Roridula gogonias is growing in wet seepage areas, these dry northern sandveld habitats or rhinoceros habitats are home of the larger species Roridula dentata, which forms tall, highly branched shrubs, which have many, many sticky rosettes of leaves at their tips. And also Roridula dentata, there's a species of Pameridea. You find that there are 2 species of Pameridea. Pameridea roridulae, a dark-colored one, is living exclusively on Roridula gogonias, and Pameridea marlottii is exclusively living on Roridula dentata. But this is Roridula dentata, and this is Pameridea roridulae. So recently these populations might have get mixed up of these bugs, either artificial, man-made, or probably because they fly. But these locations of both Roridula species are quite far apart. These are really far apart. There cannot be hybrids. I think there's one report of a potential national hybrid of Roridula dentata and Roridula gogonias made by Joachim Nerz. And I would say, whatever you found, Joachim, it was not the hybrid. There are always these indications that they're hybrids, because Roridula dentata, the early spring leaves, they look identical to those of Roridula gogonias. So young plants producing juvenile foliage might look like Roridula gogonias, but they will develop into proper Roridula dentata. And apparently from artificial crosses made, a hybrid seed of these 2 species is not viable. So another indication that this junction and the separation of the 2 species is a very old one. So here you find another photograph of this Pameridea, the symbiotic bug, which lives on this plant, uses the shelter of the plant, but it's not totally safe because they have complex food webs have established on Roridula. They're maybe not as complex as the food webs known in the pictures of Nepenthes, but also they can have up to 4 or 5 trophic stages. So we have the Roridula, which is catching the insects. We have the Pameridea bugs, which feed on the insects, or we have these spiders, Nema marlottii, which is feeding on the insects. But the spiders are also feeding regularly on the Pameridea bugs. And Bruce Anderson from South Africa made a study that these spiders control the density of the Pameridea bugs, because if there are too many Pameridea bugs, the Roridula plants suffer. I noticed this in cultivation already, that the Roridula bugs, they with the proboscis, they suck also sap from the plant, from Roridula. And if they puncture it quite often, then the plant suffers from this, from losing sap, and these are entrances for fungus and other infections. So these spiders control the density of the symbiontic bugs, form also their nests there, where they lay their eggs. And Thomas Caro made some fantastic photographs of the spider, Synema malotti, and also of this lynx spider. It's a green lynx spider. That's Poinsettia nicolae, which is feeding here on one of these Palmaridea bugs, which is almost the same size. And these spiders form their nets in Roridula dentata also. And there's another jumping spider on Roridula dentata. And there's some rare reports of an unidentified mantis. It's a nymph. It's not a natural species, which Thomas Caro also photographed, I think, in the Cederberg range. And the flowers of Roridula dentata, as I said, sometimes you can find larvae of the Palmaridea bugs. I never observed adults there. They open by an apical pore, so they have to be bus-pollinated. The pollen shape also indicates bus-pollination. Flowers, Roridula dentata, and whereas Roridula gogonius is a coastal plant, Roridula dentata occurs far more inland, and there are several. It's almost 100 kilometers here in between, so these ranges do really not overlap. And somehow the Palmaridea from there got here, but they are able to fly. And for insects, I think this is not such a big distance. So a rather not so happy part of my talk is about many of these species are in danger because they're highly localized, they are microendemics, and like in Australia, like in Indochina, human development usually destroys many of these habitats. This is a photograph taken from the Table Mountain, and you see how the settlements, how the urban developments, house building constructions come here up to the Table Mountain. Actually, this cleaning did even give some benefit to the plants because this area has been forested with pine trees, with European pine trees, which are not native to this area, and they spread there, they reproduce and cover a lot of areas. So it's the building of houses, it's hydrological buildings, and drainage areas to get some drinking water for this huge Cape Town area. So many of the seepage areas are getting drier. It's agriculture, also sad story like in Western Australia. They're producing mainly wheat. There are a lot of wine fields, cotton, and the biggest threat, I think, to the most of the northern species which grow in the dry habitats, to all the cystiflora forms, the Drosera, to Roridula dentata. I don't know if I can say it here, it's rooibos. Because this is, which is, I think, kind of national drink now in Holland. But this rooibos for these plantations, huge areas have to be cleaned to grow this species, to grow this rooibos plants. And the introduction of invasive species and also poaching, unfortunately, can cause huge damage to many populations. For example, Drosera regia, we only found about 50 plants left. So if every plant which is digged out there by plant collectors causes a high risk of extinction. Or also in Roridula, which needs dormant seeds, it needs fire for germination, and it needs the clearing of the surrounding vegetation, and so it has to produce seed every year, which are resting, then forming a seed bank in the ground. And if the seed are collected every year, this might also cause a decrease in this plant. There's a commercial seed source collecting plants in South Africa which has Roridula dentata and Roridula gogonias from wild populations every year, and they must collect hundreds of seeds from these plants. And if you think that there are only 15 plants left at one population, I think every seed grain you take causes a big risk. You can do this if the area is burned and you have hundreds of plants, but not at this low population density. So last few photographs about the Table Mountain, and you see in this Google Earth image, this is the pristine area of Table Mountain, which is a nature reserve. And you see how all these houses are coming up. These are usually shanty villages and illegal house constructions which are even built within the nature reserve, because there's a lot of water accumulating here which is running down, so you have fresh drinking water. That's, of course, these people want to be there where they have clean water, drinkable water, but it's also where these plants are growing. And remember that Drosera cunifolia is only growing here. It's the only place where it exists. So a lot of areas have been cleared out here for agriculture, or here for, this is Cape Town around the Table Mountain. And also these areas which look pristine, that's the habitat of Drosera hilaris and hermanus. You see here on the coast, very nice area on the garden route. This is the town of Hermanus, which is getting up. They built the buildings here up the hills where Drosera hilaris grows. And ironically, this newest building project is even called Sundew Village. But if this village is be built, there won't be sundews anymore. You see, this is the type location of a lavender-colored Drosera cistiflora. We wanted to go there. There's this house here. There are no plants here anymore. It's also sold or for sale. We found this huge clonal patch, the big flowered, purple, dark purple flowered Drosera pauciflora. It's growing in this area, and this is also for sale already in Darling area. Or where Drosera erigreenii grows around French Hook, the French corner. There are a lot of vineyards. You see there's no natural vegetation here anymore, only here on the hillsides. And they collect all the water, of course, for watering the plants in the dry season. This is all developed already. See, poorly natural vegetation. This is also a problem that they build some dams for to get drinkable water, especially in the surroundings of Cape Town. This is the Fernkloof Nature Reserve. That's why it's a nature reserve, because they collect water there. They need drinkable water, so no pollution here. That's why it's got a nature reserve. Same for Palmier River, and same for the Table Mountain. This is on top of Table Mountain, where there's this huge artificial lake. You can see the dam. And another thing which in these nature reserves is forbidden is this. They try to prevent fires, but this fynbush vegetation has to burn every 5 to 7 years. All the plants are adapted. Seeds of Restinaceae, seeds of many Proteaceae, seeds of Roridula, they only germinate if they're exposed to fire and if the surrounded vegetation is cleared. So if the people, are not allowed to shoot, which apparently they do, they should also set fire here from time to time. It's okay if they do not collect plants or put their dogs here, but if they shoot, they couldn't also set fire. And invasive species. It's interesting, in Australia they have problems with South African species. In South Africa, biggest threat to the national populations is wattle. This is Australian acacia. It's several species of acacia which grow over large areas, and they do not even compete with the natural vegetation. They also produce, like eucalypts, some chemicals in their leaves, and when the leaves and bark is shed, no other plants can grow beneath this. So this is really ecological desert. And they tried to get from Australia I think it's a virus which causes these cancer-like swellings and the dying of these wattles. But the problem is that this also infects natural acacias, and it infects proteas. So in Australia they have now the South African Phytophthora, which is calling the native vegetation, and they have this virus from Western Australia, which is killing their natural vegetation. So this was not like it was planned. Or here, this is the habitat of Drosera coxipetala, and there were also maybe planted or maybe naturalized European pine trees, Pinus radiata. So, speaking about ex situ conservation, there are some good and some bad points about this. First of all, you're probably familiar to this. This is the greenhouses of Thomas Caro, who sells a lot of plants out there, and he's propagating them in vitro and raising them in the greenhouse, producing masses, tons of capensis, for example, for every garden store. You can easily buy. So I think everyone who's a little bit into carnivorous plants, every child who wants to grow a sundew gets Drosera capensis easily. but in the wild it's very, very rare. But if you look at these plants, they're probably all one clone, maybe the best growing one, which is of course good for growing these plants. But for ex situ conservation, which should always have the aim to reintroduce these plants in the wild, this is not good to have just one single clone. For example, in Nepenthes clipiata, this is probably a project everyone is familiar to, conservation project. It seems to turn up that all these plants of the same sex, but Nepenthes is dioecious, and so if there are only male plants, there's no chance to reintroduce it in the wild because it will get extinct from time to time. And there is a low genetic diversity, of course, because if just we grow them from seed collected in the wild and try to raise them, but only those plants will germinate which are best adapted to artificial conditions, not to the symbiotic relationships and the other plants which are growing in the wild. There are some other roots which they have to compete. There are soil fungi, there are bacteria, viruses, and other insects. So these plants have to compete with a lot of things, and those which survive in the wild are usually not those which survive under artificial conditions. And maybe these plants already have some weak defects or something, and if we try to reintroduce them in the wild, they maybe will fully collapse. Or they might bring some diseases to the natural populations. And as they are, I'm not speaking about this nice plantation of Thomas Caro, of course, I'm speaking of general of conservation because I'm always pointing here. But if we use some fungicides or herbicides, these plants never had to compete with other plants, never had to compete with fungi. So they have a different, well, plants don't have an immune system, but maybe not the fittest clones are selected. And the other thing is in Roridula, for example, we have complex food webs. So if we want to make ex situ conservation first, if Roridula dies in the wild, the Palmeridia, the spiders, and all these animals and critters connected to Roridula will of course die. And it's just the things we know. Roridula also has some soil fungi which live in mycorrhizal symbiosis. But carnivorous plants and insects have a lobby. There are many people interested. Who's interested in soil fungi? So there's no one caring about ex situ conservation of soil fungi. But probably to reintroduce Roridula in the wild, we would need exactly these soil fungi because they grow well in artificial soils when they're fertilized or when the soil contains a lot of nutrients. But it's a quite different situation in the wild. So what I would say is that preferably conservation of plants should be habitat protection. This is first what we have to do, protect the natural habitats, because the best plant in the wild, in cultivation, or in an animal in a zoo, would always be a zoo animal, will always be a cultivated plant, which in the worst case cannot survive without humans anymore, human help. And the biggest threat for South African carnivorous plants is urban development and poaching. This is, well, very generally speaking. The poaching might be reduced because many of these areas are protected areas, are nature reserves, and South African nature laws are very, very strict. So if poachers are detected, they can be arrested and can have to pay high fines. But still, every poached Drosera regia is one plant missing in the wild and natural population. But luckily, the demand for wild collected plants is going down thanks to people who commercially propagate them. Thomas Caro, for example, raised some Roridula dentata, and maybe most plants in cultivation originate from his clones, which are grown here in vitro, raised under sterile conditions. But of course, these are always plants adapted to cultivation situations, and there's no chance that these plants, if Roridula dentata got extinct in the wild, could re-establish such nice plants and populations in the wild. So that was my talk, and I have to thank Fernando Rivadavia, who accompanied me during this travel, Stuart McPherson, Robert Gibson, Fuzzy, and Thomas Caro, of course, very old photograph taken by Eric Green, and Eric Green, which showed us most of these locations. So, are there any questions? Yep.
Just a quick question, because the conditions are extremely arid. I assume that
Yes.
the humidity level must be very high, though?
In coastal areas, yes, there's always mist and fog every morning, and you can see dew on the plants, and that's why these plants have these large stipules or are hairy to collect all of this moisture. But far inland, it's only wet when it rains, and afterwards it's very dry. It's comparable to Western Australia, to the goldfields, for example. Very dry.
So the ones that are farther inland, are they the ones that grow
The
mainly in the
humidity
wet
is very-
season and dormant in the
Yes,
dry?
they grow together with succulent euphorbias, with crustulaceae, with isoaceae, with all these mesembryanth, so with really succulent vegetation, and they grow in spots where the moisture is for some time accumulated. This is, you can, part of these species, for example Carnivorous or alba, they reach far into the north to the Namaqua vegetation, which is almost desert. Just for in the rainy season, there are some annual plants. Further questions? Yes.
You were saying that the Drosera alba roots were growing horizontally.
Yes.
Would you recommend large pots rather than
Wide pots as well. I forgot one thing. Even Drosera cistiflora has roots that are growing vertically first and then horizontally. They bend for some time. And, well, I was wondering why they plant do this, but I think it's for anchoring the plants in the soil. Because Fernando and I, we had collection permits to take some herbarium specimens from the widespread species. And, for example, Drosera pauciflora, you can easily collect with the roots because the roots are going straight down in the sand. But cistiflora is also growing in the sand, but you always break the root because it has this little angle in there, just for anchoring. Okay. Martin?
You mentioned two species of Roridula, this formata and your new one.
Yes.
What about this Beck-Hermanus?
Ah, yes. That's the third one I didn't want to deal with. Yes, this Spec Hermanus is also another plant which is in the affinity of Urticularia welwitschii, but welwitschii is a difficult complex of Urticularia. Yes, that's the third one, which I forgot.
You found it there.
And we found it there, yeah, it's growing there. Sorry that I neglected it. Further questions? Yes, we are currently working on this species. I was thinking, should I mention it here or not? But it's currently in cultivation already, spread in cultivation as Drosera species Hermanus or Drosera curviscarpa, and I always put it in parentheses because Drosera curviscarpa is already named. It's a synonym of Drosera alisiae. Drosera curviscarpa are the Drosera alisiae plants which grow in Hermanus. And this plant is different. It's not alisiae. Flowers are completely different. Yes, and we're working on to name this.
Thank you very much.